In 1 Samuel chapter 20, we pick up the story in 1 Samuel chapter 20 with, it's really the story of David, but in some ways David doesn't really have the control or influence yet. We think that King Saul does, but it's God himself. Through all these situations, it's God himself that's orchestrating these events, right? So let me just remind you where we're at. We're kind of in the middle of a long book, so it's good to kind of remember where we're at and know how to jump in here. David has been anointed to be the king back in chapter 16, but he's not going to take the throne for at least 10 to 15 years. So the entire way through this book, he's not going to be reigning on the earthly throne. And so we're in that part of the book where he's already been anointed to be king. He's already been being used of the Lord in the presence of King Saul. And Saul doesn't like it. Saul is someone who the Spirit of God has departed from. And Saul is on his own. And he is living just a lustful, envious life. And he just does not know how to deal with people of God, people of faith. And it's not just David. I mean, you even see it in Saul's own son, Jonathan. He doesn't even know how to deal with Jonathan. So David has many, many years in his life where he's in this predicament. He's in this scenario where he does not reign on the throne. Let me just take a peek for something here real quick. Okay. So, there we go. That's what I'm looking for. So a little bit of a timeline here of the life of David I just wanted you to picture, because we know that when David killed Goliath back in chapter 17, he was somewhere around 15 years old. And he will then he's a musician for King Saul right now. He's working in the court of King Saul as a musician. He also has commanded some soldiers, but Saul won't let him have much reign and authority. But there's a period of time here of 10 to 15, the formative years of his life. It's this. And again, I know people that call the second half of this book, 1 Samuel, the making of a man of God. Don't we often David, and you immediately think of King David, he's on the throne, and we start thinking about all the things he did while he was on the throne. But these are the years. These are the years of the testing, of the trying, of the forming of the character and the integrity of who he is. And it all begins in this section. So as you think about the section we're in right now, and it goes chapter after chapter of struggle after struggle for David, you need to remember that that's the type of thing that we're dealing with. Saul is openly envious now against David. Saul is openly trying to kill him, and he has to deal with this. Well, tonight's message, we're going to deal with David now needing to finally flee from the presence of King Saul. He can't even stay there anymore because Saul is openly after his life. President Truman, Harry Truman, when he was in office, he was asked about friends in Washington, D.C., and his response, he said, if you want a true friend in Washington, D.C., go buy a dog, because you can't find a good friend in politics, is his point. And David is experiencing that, having spent these years in the presence of the king, who now, it's clear, have different goals. David is following after God's own heart, and Saul is not. And so they realize that they don't have the relationship that they want, because they're headed in two separate directions. So we've seen Saul's envy, but in these 3 chapters tonight that we're going to look at, we're going to see a lot more of the loyalty that David has for his friends, his family, but also the loyalty that others have for David. There's really no better lesson in the entirety of the scripture, I would say to you, than this section right here for what it really means to be loyal. I mean, it's fellowship, it's friendship, but it's also faithfulness. It's a commitment. What is loyalty, right, when you really think about it? I recently actually just heard, it was actually Nagme. We're going to have Nagme out in a week or so, Panahi, and she mentioned about going to visit some military training canines. And she said there was just something amazing about the way those dogs wouldn't take their full attention off of their master. They were just, boom, right there. You could not get their attention off of their owner, off of their master. And that's loyalty. That is complete commitment. And that's the type of lessons we're going to see tonight in the life of David. But it's not just David. You can't have loyalty with one person. It's a relationship. between two people. So I want you to see how this is shown to us tonight. It really, this is 10 to 12 years David's going to be on the run. By the middle of these chapters here tonight, David's on the run. He's no longer in. How would you survive? Doesn't it kind of remind you of the life of Joseph in a lot of ways? Joseph, not around his home, not around his comforts, Joseph of the Old Testament. And David's going to go through a period of time like that right now, where he doesn't have any of those comforts of home. And so, yet he still remains this guy that's loyal to his friends, loyal to his family, and loyal to God. And so take a look tonight in these chapters at the loyalty that David has with his friends and family. So it starts here in chapter 20. It's verse 1 where we pick up. And so the first attribute of loyalty I want you to really see here is that loyalty, it provides compassion and kindness. There is simple comfort in loyalty. Loyalty, you can't have loyalty without there being a compassion for the other person, a kindness that's ready to help them when they need it. And so chapter 20, this whole chapter really is that story between David and Jonathan. The simple kindnesses showed, the long-term commitments shown to each other. I mean, that's compassion. They're always ready to look out for the other one. And we're going to see that in this story of Jonathan and David right here. So King Saul has already tried to kill David. Jonathan, King Saul's son, is not necessarily convinced yet that Saul really has it out for David. Now, maybe that's a bias that, Jonathan doesn't really want to see that his father hates David. Maybe Jonathan simply wasn't there when King Saul threw the javelin at David. We don't really know. But in this chapter, David is convinced that Saul's going to kill him, but Jonathan doesn't know for sure. And by the end of this chapter, they'll both know for sure. So it's chapter 20, it's verse 1. David fled from Naioth in Ramah, and he came and he said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my iniquity or sin? And what is my sin before your father, that he's seeking to kill me?" And in verse 2, he said unto him, "God forbid, you should not die. Behold, my father, he will do nothing, either great or small, but that he'll first show it to me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It's not so." Jonathan doesn't believe it. Verse 3, and David swore, moreover, and said, "Thy father certainly knows that I have found grace in your eyes." And he said, "Don't let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death," David says. And in verse 4, then said Jonathan unto David, "Whatsoever thy soul desires, I will even do it for you." So David says, look, I'm telling you, maybe your dad didn't tell you that he's after me, but I'm telling you, he's after me. I am this close to death. And Jonathan's like, okay, listen, whatever you need, I will help. So Jonathan agrees. David is rightly concerned for his life here. So Jonathan vows to help David out with Jonathan's insider knowledge, because Jonathan sits in the palace. He gets insider facts from his dad, the king, and so Jonathan vows to help David out when it comes to the need of help, okay? Verse 5, and David said unto Jonathan, "Behold, tomorrow is the new moon." So once a month there's a new moon and they hold a feast, right? "Tomorrow is the new moon, and I should not fail to sit with the king at food or at meat or at the dinner. But let me go, that I may hide myself in the field until the third day at the evening. If your father, Jonathan, if he at all misses me, then say, well, David asked me to go leave, that he might run to Bethlehem, his city, for there's a yearly sacrifice there for all the family." And in verse 7, "If he say thus, it is well, thy servant shall have peace. But if he be very angry, then be sure that evil is determined upon me." All right, so you get the picture here. David is determined to use this new moon feast as an occasion to kind of test and determine, to kind of prove to Jonathan that Saul really is after me. So David plans to be absent and not in the palace for this feast. And so and David says, so when Saul the king asks if I'm there, just tell him I had to go to my father's house for something, and if he's okay with that, then, maybe it's no big deal. But if he's angry, then we'll know he's after me and he's looking for me. So it's kind of a test that they're going to set up with David being absent from what would be considered an official function that he would be expected to be at, right? Verse 8, therefore thou shalt deal kindly with thy servant, for you have brought thy servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. This is David still talking to Jonathan. Notwithstanding, if there be in me sin or iniquity, then slay me yourself. For why should you bring me to your father? And Jonathan said, far be it from me. For if I knew certainly that evil was determined by my father to come upon you, then would I not tell you? Of course I'd tell you, he's saying. In verse 10, then said David to Jonathan, who shall tell me? Or what if your father answers you roughly? So David says, well, what if your dad is so mad at you, Jonathan, that he imprisons you or tortures you and doesn't let you go? Who would come and tell me, is the idea. Verse 11, and Jonathan said unto David, come and let us go out into the field. And they went out, both of them, into the field, because Jonathan has a plan. So David plans to be absent from this feast as kind of a test to prove to Jonathan that Saul's angry, right? And so the idea here is that David's not even worth living. You're all I got left, okay? I need your support in this. And Jonathan's like, of course I will help you. And so they make this covenant together. But David is concerned that Jonathan's going to get himself into trouble with his father. And so Jonathan says, well, wait a second, I got a plan. I know how to do this. And now the plan is going to be explained here by Jonathan starting in verse 12. So here's Jonathan's plan for David to be absent from this feast, and yet neither one of them really get quote unquote caught. Okay? Verse 12. Jonathan said unto David, O Lord God of Israel, when I have sounded my father about tomorrow at any time or on the third day, and behold, if there is good towards David, and I then send not unto thee and show it to thee, the Lord do so and much more to Jonathan. But if it pleases my father to do thee evil, then I will show it to thee and send thee away, that you may go in peace. And the Lord be with thee as he hath been with my father. And so the idea here is that Jonathan is saying, if I don't come to you and tell you that my father's angry, may the Lord smite me down, is what Jonathan's saying. But he says, I will come to you and I will tell you. And so in verse 14, Jonathan continues and says, and you shall not only while yet I live show me kindness. I'm sorry, this is David in verse 14. Don't just show me kindness while I live, but the kindness of the Lord, even that I die not. Verse 15. But also, you shall not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord hath cut off the enemies of David, every one of them from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord even require it at the hand of David's enemies. And Jonathan caused David to swear again, because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. And so, look, through all of these words, the idea is they're both coming into this agreement that when they find out that King Saul actually is angry at David and wanting to kill him, they agree to not only not turn against each other, they agree, even there in verse 15? When it says in verse 15, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. The agreement here is so deep. They're saying, listen, tell me that we're going to be loyal to each other, even to the point where, David, you'll be loyal to my kids. And Jonathan's saying, David, I'll be loyal to your kids. And they're going to that extent to say, your family will be my family will be your family. We're in this together, generationally. And that's the type of commitment they're making to each other right here. You know, in Proverbs, it says in I think I have it here. Wow, can't possibly be that far behind. There it is. Proverbs chapter 17, verse 17. It says, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. I love that. I mean, that's the loyalty of Jonathan right there. That is the loyalty of Jonathan. It's It's more than a blood relationship even. So Jonathan intends to rescue David from Saul for good. And they make this covenant for not only them, but even for their whole lineage. Okay, verse 18, let's keep going. So then Jonathan said to David, tomorrow is the new moon feast, and you shall be missed, because your seat will be empty. And when you have stayed for 3 days, then you shall go down quickly and come to the place where you did hide yourself when the business was at hand, and shall remain by the stone of Ezel. So David is to leave the palace for 3 days and be hiding in the field. In verse 20, Jonathan says, I will shoot 3 arrows on the side thereof, as though I shot at a mark, or at a target. And behold, I will send a young lad, saying, go and find the arrows. If I expressly say to that lad, behold, lad, the arrows are on this side of you, then take them and come here, for there is peace unto you and no hurt, as the Lord lives. But in verse 22, if I say thus to the young man, behold, the arrows are beyond thee, go thy way, for the Lord has sent thee away. And as concerning, or as touching the matter which you and I have spoken of, behold, the Lord be between me and thee forever. So the whole idea is that once Jonathan finds out if Saul is truly angry, if Saul's really angry, then when Jonathan shoots the arrow, he's going to tell the young boy that ran out to find the arrow, go further. The arrow must be past you. Keep going. And that's David's key, that he's hiding in the field somewhere. That's his key to leave. But if Jonathan is able to say to the boy running after his arrow, it's back this way, come back closer, then that's David's key to know that it's okay and Saul's not angry. So they've got this plan worked out so that David can be gone, and yet Jonathan can still communicate to David to tell him if there's peace or not. So I love that. I love the fact that they have this kind of commitment to each other. But did you notice all through this section, though, Jonathan says things like he said in verse 23, where he says, as concerning the matter which you and I have spoken of, behold, the Lord is between me and you forever. Jonathan's saying, regardless of what happens here, even if I have to tell you that Saul's upset, even if I have to send you away, you just remember, David, the Lord is between me and you. The Lord is with us together. The Lord is the one that will hold this covenant, this loyalty of ours together. And that really ultimately is the strength to be loyal to somebody, right? I often think, how many marriages wouldn't last if they simply didn't have the Lord in them? You know, just that alone, I mean, is enough to bring the loyalty up to where it needs to be, even in a marriage. So that devotion that these guys have for each other, it's grounded in their devotion to God. It's grounded in their understanding that God has the ability to keep them focused on his will, which keeps them coming together. I love that. I love that. Verse 24. And so David did. He hid himself in the field, and when the new moon feast was come, the king sat himself down to eat. And the king sat upon his seat, as at other times, even upon a seat by the wall. And Jonathan arose, and Abner sat by Saul's side. Abner, of course, is the general of the army, right? And David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul spoke not anything that day, for he thought something had befallen him. Maybe David's unclean. Surely he's just unclean. And so Saul noticed that David was missing from the first day of this feast, but he just chalked it off as, well, David must be ceremonially unclean. According to the law of Moses, David must just be unclean, and that's why he couldn't come. If you take a look at Leviticus chapter 23, there are many things that could make somebody ceremonially unclean for a day. Touching a dead body, things like this. You know, having to bury somebody. These are things that could make you ceremonially unclean until the sun goes down, and then the next day you're ceremonially ready to go back. Okay? And so Saul sees David absent and just chalks it off as, well, David must just be ceremonially unclean. I'm sure he'll be here tomorrow. But that's not the case. So verse 27, it came to pass on the next day, which was the second day of the month, that David's place was empty again. And Saul said to Jonathan, his son, wherefore cometh not the son of Jesse to food, to the meal, neither yesterday or today? Why didn't David come? And verse 28, Jonathan answered Saul and said, David earnestly asked leave of me to go down to Bethlehem. And Saul said, in verse 29, and he said, let me go, I pray thee, for our family, David's family, hath a sacrifice in the city, and my brother, he which commanded me to be there, and now, if I have found favor in your eyes, let me go away, and I pray thee, and see my brethren. Therefore he cometh not unto the king's table. So this is Jonathan's explanation to his father. This is why David's not here, because he asked me if he could be excused, and Jonathan says I gave him permission to be excused. So you can see that the prince of Israel, the king's son, Jonathan, had this kind of authority. And so Jonathan's telling his dad, well, I gave him permission to not be here. Now, watch the reaction of King Saul here in verse 30. Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said unto him, thou son of the perverse, rebellious woman, do not I know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own confusion, and unto the confusion of your mother's nakedness? I'm going to have to explain that one in modern English to you in just a second. Verse 31, and Saul continues and says, for as long as the son of Jesse lives upon the ground, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die. So now there is no question in Jonathan's mind that Saul is out for David. But did you notice the vitriol in these verses from King Saul? I mean, this is a guy that is lashing out in the flesh. David is not there. Saul, all he wants is power and control. And he's realizing he doesn't have control anymore over this David. This David that is attracting all of the people to like him because of David's godly attributes, right? And Saul's realizing he's losing control over David. And he lashes out at Jonathan. Verse 30. Well, let me go to verse 31, first of all. In verse 31, first Saul threatens Jonathan in verse 31 and says that, Jonathan, I will not allow you to take over my kingdom, and I will not give you the right to rule in Israel when I die unless you help me catch David. He's blackmailing his own son into hating a guy, David, that didn't do anything wrong. I mean, how envious and wicked is this, right? And did you see what he said to Jonathan in verse 30? He literally claimed that Jonathan is having a homosexual relationship with David. Did you catch that? That's what he's saying in verse 30. He's smearing his own son by all, thou son of the perverse, rebellious woman. First he's calling him an illegitimate son. And then he says, do not I know that you have chosen David to your own confusion? And that language literally means you've chosen him to be a mate. A partner is what it's talking about. Saul is, talk about besmirching somebody's character. He is being as dominating and trying to be as control hungry as he can be. You will not reign over my throne as long as he lives. You break off this relationship with him, or else, I will not allow you to reign, kind of thing. This is not the way you gender loyalty, right? By blackmailing your son and by smearing his character. That Saul needs to learn a lesson or two about loyalty. You look at the life of King Saul, and then you look at the life of David, and it is a complete opposite in nearly every way. And loyalty is just another example. You follow King Saul's example, and all it does is it pushes people away. And then you look at David just simply showing compassion and kindness, and it just genders people to come and want to be around him. And David's not even trying. He's just multiplying people all around him because of that simple compassion. That simple compassion like that. It's just amazing. And so Jonathan now knows that Saul's out for him. In verse 32, so Jonathan answered Saul his father and said unto him, why shall he be killed? What has he done? And Saul cast a javelin at him. Now Saul's casting javelins even at Jonathan to smite him, whereby Jonathan knew that it was determined of his father to kill David. So Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and did eat no more the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David, because his father had done him shame. So because of King Saul's illogical and shameful outburst, Jonathan's done, man. He storms out, and Jonathan fully gets it. And you could honestly look at this moment as the moment that Saul lost his son. You know, I think sometimes we think about an act as the act that lost a relationship. You know, we think of an event like, you know, I've had enough of you, pack up your stuff and leave my house. You know, we think of that day as the moment. You know, like maybe Jonathan packs up and leaves right now. We think of that day as the day that ended the relationship. Or we think of the divorce papers, you know, as the end of the relationship, right? And guys, I tell you, that is not the end of the relationship. The end of the relationship is when the smearing of the character, when the blackmailing of the person, when all of these activities that breaks the relationship happens. That's the real broken relationship. So, and people like Saul, they don't even realize it until the moment comes and it's too late. It's the same as in a marriage. The abandonment or the abuse issues and the loss of the relationship, even while you're present with each other, that's the end of the relationship. The divorce papers just formalize it. So I think we need to put some more emphasis on the character and the process than the emphasis on the some event of moving out or something else. And so all of these things that Saul's been doing to Jonathan, these are the things that have been ruining this relationship. And the whole time, David's doing the opposite. David's doing all of these compassion and kindness things that are just gendering relationship and just bringing people close to him. And it continues in David's life that way. So verse 35. It came to pass in the morning that Jonathan went out into the field at the time appointed with David, and the lad was with him, the young lad that's going to go get the arrows, right? And he said unto the young lad, run and find the arrows which I shoot. And as the lad ran, he shot the arrow beyond him. And when the lad was come to the palace of the arrow which Jonathan had shot, Jonathan cried after the lad and said, isn't the arrow beyond you? And of course, that's the sign to David to know Saul is mad and you need to flee. You need to get out of here for good. And Jonathan, in verse 38, cried after the lad, make speed, make haste, let's go, stay not. And Jonathan's lad gathered up the arrows and he came to his master. But the lad did not know anything. They didn't let him in on what the communication meant, what the secret code message meant. Only Jonathan and David knew the matter. And Jonathan gave his, you gotta love the King James, artillery, his arrows. Jonathan gave his arrows unto his lad and said to him, go, carry them into the city. So Jonathan covertly communicates to David so that Saul and Saul's loyal soldiers don't find out that this is actually Jonathan communicating to David to say, you need to leave. There's nothing here for you anymore but death. Saul is after you. So Jonathan and David will only see each other one time after the events of this chapter in the rest of their life. I mean, we read this chapter. Well, let's read the last two verses, and then I want to make a point, okay? So in verse 41, as soon as the lad was gone, David arose out of his place towards the south and fell on his face to the ground and bowed himself 3 times and then kissed one another, because Jonathan ran out to where David was. They kissed one another and wept one with another until David exceeded in crying. In verse 42, Jonathan said to David, go in peace, for as much as we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever. And he arose and he departed, and Jonathan went into the city. This is the final meeting they're going to have. They're going to see each other one other time in a couple of years. And that's it. And you read this chapter and you read about this physical parting of David and Jonathan, only to see each other one time the rest of their life. And in this chapter is so geared to that emotion of they've separated. But I tell you what, the thing this chapter needs to scream out to you is the separation of Saul and Jonathan that just happened. See, the loyalty that builds the relationship between Jonathan and David is there still, and it continues and carries on, and it has effects in other people's lives, like Jonathan's son that we're going to read about. So though the physical togetherness is going to be done for David and Jonathan, don't worry about it. God has them, and they will be in heaven even together forever. What you need to worry about is the King Sauls that are ruining relationships left and right, and they don't even realize that in the presence of all these people that have to be there, they've lost everything. Saul just lost his son in this chapter. You want to talk about a parting in this chapter? Don't worry about David and Jonathan. Worry about the King Sauls. Those are the people that we need to be concerned about. Those are the people that we need to try to restore with and try to correct and try to bring it back. Try to get them to see God's goodness. This chapter is not a parting of David and Jonathan. This chapter is a parting of Jonathan and his father. David and Jonathan will go on because there's loyalty. Chapter 21 is a bit shorter, so we can get through this one quickly. In fact, as short as it is, it has two little stories in it. So number one, from the chapter that we just read, loyalty. It's got compassion. It's got kindness. Okay? Chapter 21 now, David is finally and officially on the run. And this chapter teaches us something else about loyalty. That in loyalty, it provides true provision and protection. Okay? In other words, you can't say you're loyal to somebody and have kindness for somebody and compassion for somebody if you don't ever help them. Right? And that's what this chapter reminds us. Through all of the compassion and all of the help and all of the feelings of loyalty, there has to also be the substance of loyalty. And this chapter really brings that out. Okay? That there is actual provision and protection and actual help that comes with loyalty. Take a look at chapter 21. It's verse 1. Then came David to Nob. This is another town. Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David, and he said to him, David, why are you here alone and no one is with you? And David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has commanded me to go about a business and hath said to me, let no man know anything. So there is no sugarcoating this. David lies to the priest here at Nob. He lies to cover up his running away from King Saul. Saul didn't, he believed that Saul, he's running away from King Saul because he didn't know if this priest would be loyal to him or if this priest would be loyal to King Saul. So David lies and says, oh, well, King Saul sent me on this mission. I just want to point this out. I don't know if this is viewable from where you're at, but David was up here in Ramah, and then he fled here to Nob, which is where he's at right now. We're going to see tonight that he's then going to go over to Gath of the Philistines before finally tonight he's going to travel the whole way over here into Moab. So we're going to see some of those travelings tonight. But for the next 10 years, David is going to have to be traveling around to keep himself safe and protected from King Saul. So here David meets the priest at Nob where the tabernacle was. And in verse 3, it continues here. And so now David's gotten the priest, Ahimelech, to calm down. And he says in verse 3, now therefore, what is here with you? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, and what there is present. David's saying, what kind of food do you have here? I'm hungry. And the priest in verse 4 answered David and said, there's no common bread here under my hand, but there is hallowed bread. If the young men have kept themselves at least from women, because remember David said that I've come here with my men on a business from King Saul. And so the priest is saying, I don't have any regular bread. The only thing I have here to eat is the showbread. Do you remember in the tabernacle had 12 loaves of, was it 10? Loaves of showbread, or special bread, bread of the presence. It was to represent how they were always held before, Israel was always there held before God in the presence of God. And once a week, they would change out that bread, and they would put out fresh bread that would stay there on the table in the presence of God the whole time. So once a week, they would have to pull back the old bread, and then the priests would be able to eat that. But that was considered hallowed bread or holy bread, right? And so it's not, it's for the priests to eat. That was for their provision. And so the priest tells David, that's the only bread I have here. And in verse 5, David answered the priest and said unto him, of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days since I have come, and the vessels of the young men are clean or holy, and the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it was sanctified this day in the vessel. So in verse 6, the priest gave him the hallowed bread, for there was no bread there except for that showbread that was taken from before the Lord, and put hot bread in the day when it was taken away, because once a week on the Sabbath day they would change out the bread. So the priest was willing to give David this bread. Why? To save David's life. David is exclaiming, we don't have any bread left, we have nothing left in our clean drinking vessels, we're desperate for food. And so the priest is willing to give David that bread to save his life. It wasn't meant for David. It was meant for the priests. It was meant for a religious activity. It was meant for something that represented God. And the priest said, you know what? Your life is more important than a religious activity. I'm going to provide for you. I believe the Lord is telling me to provide for you. And he did. And he did. Not everybody would have agreed with this priest in this day. You could just see the Pharisees and the Sadducees, had they lived back in this day, they'd be like, how could you give this bread to him? I don't care if he's going to die. That bread was set apart in the law of Moses for the priests, and they would have just been freaking out because some letter of their law wasn't followed. And the priest's only commandment to David was, just tell me that you're ceremonially not unclean. Just tell me that you haven't been doing wickedness or sleeping around, is the idea. And David's like, no, we haven't. And so the priest says, okay, well, if you're not ceremonially unclean, then all right, yeah, we need to save your life. I'm going to give you this bread. Jesus' disciples, it's recorded in a few different gospels, Jesus' disciples were going through the cornfields, the wheat fields. And they were going through on the Sabbath day, and they were plucking out the wheat, and they were rolling it around, blowing off the chaff and eating the wheat. And sure enough, the Pharisees were there that day. How dare you let your disciples eat that? They are harvesting grain. They're working on the Sabbath day. That's not allowed, right? And Jesus is, first of all, freaking out at them. Like, they didn't just break out the tractor and the combine. They're just getting a little something to eat, relax. But he ends that, and I think I might have it here, but Jesus ends that section by telling the Pharisees an example of why it was okay for Jesus' disciples to have something to eat on the Sabbath day like they were. And this is Jesus' response. This is as it's recorded in Mark chapter 2. It's verse 25. And Jesus said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and he was hungry? He and they that were with him, how he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, we'll get to that, the high priest, and he did eat the showbread, which was not lawful to eat, but for the priests only. And he gave it also to them that were with him. And he said to them, Jesus now says to the Pharisees, the Sabbath is not made for man, but man is made, I'm going to say it again. The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath day was made to help man have that rest, have that break. It wasn't made to prevent man from good things. The Sabbath day was there to provide good things. And I tell you, this will be until the day you die, that people will always look at religion in one of two ways. They will look at true religion, true Christianity, and they will either look at it as something that's trying to prevent them or as something that's God trying to provide for them. And that's the whole message Jesus is trying to say to them there. Look, the Sabbath isn't there to prevent you from eating when you're in need of food. It's there to provide a rest and provide the other things that the Sabbath does. Provide a chance to reflect and rehash. Okay? And now he's using that as an example of this same thing David did. The hallowed bread, the show bread that was put in the tabernacle, later into the temple, yes, it was there as a religious picture of saying Israel is always before the presence of God. And then it gets changed out once a week. But it wasn't there to hinder men from what they need. It was there to provide for men what they needed. So if men literally needed to eat or starve, God says that's fine. So I challenge you to think about that. When you look at the principles of the Word of God from beginning to end, you have to think about them as principles that are there to provide for us. They're not to provide for us good things, natural things, godly things. They're not there to prevent us from having things that are necessary. And David even benefits from that lesson right here. So it's the same here for this bread. It's there to help and to be a provision. And the priest knew that. The priest said, you know what? I'm going to provide for you. God wants to provide for you. You're in need, and I'm going to provide for you. Now continue here to verse 7. Verse 7, now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there at the tabernacle that day. He was detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg. He was an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen that belonged to Saul. So you can imagine herdsmen would have been coming back and forth to the tabernacle a lot, bringing sheep for sacrifice and things like that, maybe even other animals. So at this time, this herdsman of Saul, Doeg, he's there and he overhears, he sees David. Now we don't know if Doeg is aware of the conflict between Saul and David. We don't know. But we know this, that Doeg is going to come up later in the story, and we're going to find out who his allegiance is with in just a minute. So Doeg sees this whole thing where the priest gives David the bread. And now in verse 8, David said to Ahimelech, and is there not here under thy hand a spear or a sword? What's David saying? He's saying, I need protection. Thank you for the provision. Now I need protection. Is there a sword or a spear here? For I have neither brought my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. And the priest said, well, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you slew in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. For if thou wilt take that, then take it. For there is no other sword here other than that. And David said, there is none like that. Give it to me. And so there was only one sword. It was the sword of Goliath. And so David takes the sword. So he gets that very sword of Goliath for protection while he's on the run. Now, I want you to keep in mind where David is heading to next is to the Philistines. He's actually heading to the very city of Goliath. He's going to be dragging Goliath's sword along with him. Talk about irony. So David now has been provided with the provision of the Lord and now the protection of the Lord to take with him. I truly believe that the Lord would have provided these same things for David whether he lied or not. I think we make such a cover for people in the scripture that lie, and we don't have to. David did not have to lie, and the Lord still would have provided the things that David needed. The Lord still would have been loyal. The Lord still would have been loyal to David. So verse 10. And so now we see David running to this Philistine city in verse 10. David arose and he fled that day for fear of Saul, and he went to Achish, the king of Gath, and that's Goliath's hometown. And the servants of Achish said to him, isn't this David, the king of the land? Even the Philistines thought David was the king by reputation. Isn't that funny? Did they not sing one to another of him in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his 10,000s? And David laid up these words in his heart and was sore afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So David initially thought that the Philistine king would help him, okay? Sort of like that enemy of my enemy is your friend kind of thing. Like, well, Saul's trying to kill me, so if I go over to Saul's enemies, maybe I'll be okay. That was David's initial thought, but he quickly realized that these Philistines are not going to show David any sympathy. So, of course, David comes here from the tabernacle, and now he's over. The Philistine territory, of course, was right along the Mediterranean. Their 5 cities were right over there. So David has now come here to Gath to be with the Philistines, and he realizes quickly they're going to be scared of him, thinking that he's there to do some kind of subterfuge and actually kill them. So David's changing his mind, like, this isn't going to work to hang out with the enemies of God. Verse 13, and so David changed his behavior before them, and he feigned himself mad in their hands, and he scrabbled on the doors of the gates, and he let his spit fall down upon his beard. So he literally played like he's mad, like he's out of his mind. And in verse 14, then said Achish unto his servants, Lo, you see this man, he's crazy. Wherefore then why have you brought him to me? Have I need of a madman that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? And so Achish is like, I don't need any crazy people around here. Get him out. And it works. And it works. So they end up sending him out. And guys, we can learn something here. When you're having issues with the people of God, the place to go for help and loyalty and protection and provision and friendship is not the enemies of God. You will not find help amongst the enemies of God. How many people have trouble in their marriage or trouble at work, and then they run down to the bar and get drunk? It doesn't work well. It doesn't pan out. The enemies of God will never provide you what you need, what you think they're going to give you. And David learned that lesson right here in a very clear way. Now, I want to go into the next chapter for just a few verses to continue this point about how loyalty provides protection and provision, because David is going to now have to come back into Israel, and it didn't work out for him amongst the Philistines. And look how the chapter 22 begins. David therefore departed from there, and he escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all of his father's house heard it, they went down there to him, and everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, everyone that was discontent, gathered themselves unto him, and he became a captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. Put yourself in David's shoes. You are hated by the authorities. You're hated by the ruling class. Most of the people are intimidated to be okay with you because the rulers hate you. So the common person is keeping their distance from you. And now these 400 people gather to him. Can you imagine the shot in the arm that would be? The boost that would be. When you're in the minority, when you're down and out, and people come and you ever had that happen to you where you're down, maybe you're sitting somewhere, you're down and out, and somebody just comes up and sits next to you. They don't even have to say a word, but just that they're there. And they're willing to just be there with you in that minute. And that's what David's experience. 400 people came to be with him. I mean, to have people to support you like that. When you're in the minority, when you don't have much to offer them, and yet there's people of that great of loyalty that would just come and rally around you. I mean, that is friendship, right? That is loyalty. And now David's going to continue to return that type of affection and protection right here in verse 3. Watch this. David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. So now David is going the whole way over to the Moab territory on the other side of the Dead Sea. And it says here in Moab that David said to the king of Moab, "Let my father and my mother, I pray thee, come here and be with you until I know what God's going to do for me." And in verse 4, he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the while that David was in the hold, or in the hold of Adullam. So even while David is endangered and running for his own life, he's still thinking about protecting his own family, protecting his own mom and dad, because that's what loyalty does. It doesn't just say I love you, but it actually helps. It's actually looking to provide what others need in those desperate moments. Even when you don't have much to offer, David still had something he could offer them. He had that, I know what I can do for them. I can get them over to another country, a foreign country that will protect them, that aren't necessarily the enemies of God, like they were over in the Philistine territory. David's always looking out for others. Even in his moments of having not much to offer, he's like, I still got something I can offer. I can still help others. Wow. I mean, how many people in their desperate moments, all they can think about is themselves. Like, I got to fix my problem. I got to fix my problem. And here's David, lost his home, lost everything. He's on the run. Wait a second, I got to help my parents. I can't just abandon them. And he helps his own parents out. I mean, that is great, great loyalty. I love it. I love it. Now, he's on the run, and now we're going to flash back to King Saul. And we're going to learn a lesson about loyalty from the negative example for the rest of this chapter 22. We're going to learn something about loyalty, and we're going to find out that loyalty is only as good as the one you're loyal to. Okay? You can have great loyalty for somebody, but if they're an absolute scoundrel, it does you no good. And it's not going to do them any good. And so David's going to, not even David, but Jonathan and others are going to learn that. And David too, in this chapter, in fact. So let's continue here in verse 5. The prophet Gad came and said to David, "Don't stay here in the hold, but depart and get thee into the land of Judah." So then David departed, and he came into the forest of Harath. So David is moved as God speaks through a prophet of God to move him back from Moab, back into the land of Israel in the southern part called Judah. Now in verse 6, when Saul heard that David was found and the men that were with him, now Saul was there in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. Then Saul, in verse 7, said unto his servants that stood by him, "Hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse," we're talking about David, "give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds?" He's saying, can David do that for you? The insinuation is, I can do that for you. In verse 8, that all of you have conspired against me, and there's nobody that is showing me that my son hath made a league with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you that is sorry for me, or shows unto me that my son has stirred up my servant against me. Me. It's all about me. You can just see Saul pouting. Like, why isn't anybody helping me? Oh, I got to make it through the verse. That my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. Saul has no concept of how to create loyal servants. He's literally trying to guilt trip them and to bribe them into helping him meet his mission of killing David. You can't guilt trip somebody and bribe somebody into loyalty. And yet that's all that Saul has left. It's so sad. It's all about him, and all he can do to get people on his side is say, you know, if you would only help me, I would be able to provide you fields, and I would be able to promote you. And oh, how sad. How sad when you have to bribe people to get them to like you. Why not just be a compassionate, loving, providing, protective person, and then people will want to be around you. Poor Saul. You almost feel bad for him at this point. Verse 9. So there was somebody there listening to Saul give this pitiful speech. It was Doeg. Remember Doeg that actually watched the priest give David the bread? Well, Doeg heard this speech of Saul. So in verse 9, Then answered Doeg the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and he said, well, I saw the son of Jesse come to Nob to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him food, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Then the king sent to call Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house. So the priests that were in Nob, and they came, all of them, to the king. So Doeg basically ratted and said, okay, well, yeah, I saw David was there. And so King Saul asked for all of these priests to come to where King Saul was. So now we know where Doeg's allegiance was. He decides he's going to be loyal to King Saul. And I want to point something out to you. He decided to be loyal to King Saul after he sees Saul's absolute pity party and guilt trip and all of this shame. And he still decides to be loyal to this ungodly king. It's a sad, sad truth. But that's where Doeg's loyalties lie. Verse 12, here come the priests to Saul. Saul said to the priest, hear now, thou son of Ahitub. And he answered, Here am I, my lord. And Saul said to him, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and you have inquired of the Lord for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait as it is right now? Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, and who is this, and who is so faithful among all your servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law? And he goes at your bidding, and he's honorable in their house. Ahimelech, the priest, is saying, why are you upset with David? David's nothing but loyal to you. I don't even know why you're mad at David. So that's the priest's argument. Like, what's going on here? I didn't even know you were mad at him. And in verse 15, did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Be it far from me. Let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor to all the house of my father. For thy servant didn't know anything about this, less or more. So the priest is just admitting to helping a desperate man. He's like, David was there and I helped a desperate man. He didn't know anything about Saul and David being angry with each other. So these priests were just living this simple life, being loyal to God. That literally is their defense. Look, we don't know anything about your petty squabbles. We just saw a man in need and we helped him. They're just loyal to God and loyal to the truth. These priests are innocent bystanders, just living for the Lord, being loyal to God and doing what's right. And look what happens to them in verse 16. And the king said, you shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all of your father's house. And the king said to the footmen, and by the way, let me just pause. Why is King Saul going to kill these priests? Because they helped a man with bread? This is ungodly, sinful envy and anger that has led to hatred. Saul is so hateful in his heart towards David, it will lead to actual murder. There's no... Can you imagine? I mean, if I said to you, why did you help my enemy? And you're like, well, he was going to die and I just gave him bread. I'm going to kill you. Why would you do that? I mean, that is absolute hatred for somebody. So Saul wants to kill these priests now in verse 17. The king said to the footmen that stood about him, turn and slay these priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when David fled, and they didn't show it to me. But the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the priests of the Lord. They wouldn't do it. In verse 18, the king said to Doeg, all right, Doeg, then you do it. Turn thou and fall upon these priests. And Doeg the Edomite did it. And he fell upon the priests and he slew them that day. There was 85 people of the family of this priest, and Doeg killed them all, of those that wore the linen ephod. In verse 19, and Nob, the city of the priests, Doeg smote he with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and sucklings, and ox and donkeys and sheep with the edge of the sword. All because this wicked King Saul told him to do this. I mean, talk about evil. Even the servants of Saul knew in the military, you can only disobey an unlawful command, right? These servants realize, like, this is an unlawful command. Like, you can't order us to kill these priests. They didn't do anything wrong. All of these priests stood up and said, with a moral conscience, I cannot do this. But here you have Doeg, some herdsman that's probably looking for a promotion. I don't want to do sheep anymore. I'd really like to work in the palace now, kind of thing. And he's going to do it. He's going to do this wicked act. You can have loyalty to the wrong thing, guys. You can be committed to the wrong thing or to the wrong person. There are people that sincerely want to know who God is, that are committed to the Catholic Church, and they need to come away and find the Lord. There are people that are seriously committed to want to know the Lord, that are committed to the Mormon Church. They're committed to the wrong thing. They need to find the Lord and come away from that. These servants that refuse to kill these priests, they need to realize, like, I can't be loyal to a king that would murder an innocent man anymore. I can't do that. And they need to come away. But here's Doeg, probably with self-interest in mind, that says, well, if I be loyal to the king, maybe I can get something out of this. How sad. How sad. Now, it does end on quite a positive note, though. So, oh boy. Let's go to verse... Okay, so Doeg wipes out these priests. Okay, let me just go into this. David wrote in Psalm 52, David actually wrote this whole psalm about this event when Doeg wiped out these priests. So if you read Psalm 52 in your Bible, it'll have a header that says how David wrote this to Doeg. And so Psalm 52 verse 7, David says, "Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but he trusted in the abundance of riches, and he strengthened himself in his own wickedness." David himself is saying this was the motivation of Doeg's heart. He was going greedy after gain. If I'm loyal to Saul, he'll promote me. He'll give me riches. That is the worst kind of loyalty that you can even have. But praise God for these servants of Saul's that would not wipe out these innocent priests. Those servants of Saul, they were more loyal to God than King Saul was himself, because they refused an unlawful command, basically, from the king. Now, let's finish this chapter here. It's verse 20 till the end. Verse 20, one of the sons of Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Ahitubah, named Abiathar escaped, and he fled. So remember, Doeg is going around killing the entire family of Ahimelech, but Abiathar escapes, and he flees to where David is. And in verse 21, Abiathar showed to David that Saul had slain the Lord's priests, I'm sure with much tears. And in verse 22, David said unto Abiathar, I knew it that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all of the persons of your father's house. That's David saying, I'm responsible for this. Oh, man. In verse 23, he tells Abiathar, stay here with me. Don't fear. For he that seeks my life is now seeking your life. But with me, you shall be safeguarded. So David's feeling guilty for the death of Abiathar's family. He says, you stay here with me, and I will protect you, provide for you. I will have compassion for you. We will build our own loyalty together. It's good for David to comfort someone that's going through the same thing as he is, but frankly, David's responsible for this, for David's lying to the priest. Now, what is interesting here is that this Abiathar, the priest, he will become the high priest for David when David takes the throne. So when David says here in verse 23, stay here with me and I will safeguard you, he means it. David has a true loyalty that comes out everywhere he goes. Jonathan, We saw his wife, Michal, helping him earlier. We see Jonathan help him again. We see the 400 men come to him. We see him helping his family. Now we see this guy that David's like, you stay with me, and this will work out well. We'll see David establish this relationship. And it's the beginning of another very long, loyal relationship for David. So what do you see tonight when you think about loyalty between David and Saul? Loyalty can't be bought. It can't be earned. It's a part of how you live your life. David didn't ask for anybody's loyalty. He didn't ask for them to be faithful. He didn't say, well, I'll tell you what, if you're faithful to me, then it'll be good for you. No, people are naturally attracted to somebody that is helping them, that has compassion, kindness. You can't have the protection and provision without the compassion and kindness. That's heartless, right? Like money for the plebeians, here, take the money, but you can't have the other either. You can't just have this compassion and, I really wish I could help you. The whole time you got a pocket full of money, I wish you the best, and then you never help. David had both. He had all of that. And it attracts people, and it builds bonds and long-lasting relationships. And this whole section ends not with the dissolution of David and Jonathan's loyalty. No, it was the dissolution of Jonathan and Saul's. But it ends with yet another loyal relationship being built for David, even while he's on the run. You think of the hard times as the worst times? Really? They're the hard times, don't get me wrong. But are they the worst times? Are they the times that nothing is productively happening in your life? No, I don't think so. I'll give an example. Even right now, we think of very hard times, horrible things happening in Ukraine. The atrocities that we're seeing today haven't been seen hardly even since World War I and World War II. Today, a maternity hospital was bombed, right? 9-month pregnant women bombed in this hospital. And many deaths, many maimed. You see pictures and videos of people being hauled out on stretchers. And it's just, you think of the atrocities, and there's so many hard things happening. But even through it all, you see God working and God building relationships and building people. Just today, it was announced that there's now 15,000 Jews waiting to make Aliyah to come back to Israel from Ukraine and from Russia, because they know they need to come home. They need to come home to Israel. And so God's working, and he's doing a thing there. And there's relationships being built, and there's people coming together that it would have never come together before. And so remember that in these times. And David is going to be made into the man of God that he is because of these times. And this character continually comes out. And yet for Saul, it's the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite. So as the church, we have much more within the church for loyalty than President Truman had with his dog, okay? Within the church, we have great opportunity to show loyalty and true kindness and protection for each other. So, living in a world of envious Sauls out there, isn't it great to know that you can come and be around the people of God and have that compassion and have the simple kindness, and yet also the provision and the help in the faithfulness of God's people. So number one, loyalty provides kindness and compassion. When you're loyal like David is, it's easy for it to come back to you. When you're loyal like David, it's easy for protection to come back and everything, for kindness, for comfort. Loyalty also provides for provision and protection. Faithfulness to others will prompt you to want to improve others' situation. It's not good enough that you just say, I wish I could help. Loyalty makes you want to get involved and help people at every chance you can, even if you don't have much to offer. But be careful, because loyalty is only as good as the one that you place your loyalty into. If you're like Doeg and you place your loyalty in Saul, it will not get you anywhere, and we'll see that. But if you're like Jonathan and Abiathar, and you place your loyalty in a David, it will get you somewhere. But certainly if you put your trust and your loyalty in me, it's only going to take you so far. But if you put your loyalty and trust in the one that you should, in Jesus Christ himself, he has the true power and ability to comfort and to carry you through to the end. So that's the ultimate story here of loyalty. Yeah, be loyal to the Davids in your life. Try to help the Sauls in your life. But find that loyalty with God and build on that. Build on that relationship. Have that same kind of kindness and compassion for him. Have that same kind of want to provide for him. And you'll see that he's doing the same thing right back for you. That he's wanting to show kindness to you. He's wanting to provide for you the whole time. And that relationship just builds. So be a David. Be a David. Don't be like a Saul, right? Amen. Amen. Hey guys, let's close. Let's close in prayer. Let's talk to the Lord about this. God, thank you for this lesson here. It's so easy in these lessons to see the difference between the Sauls in the world and the Davids in the world.